Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. As you know, my name is Philip Eyre. I'm from the UNFCCC Secretariat. I lead the team for markets and non-markets and have previously been supporting a lot of the negotiations on Article 6, including the drafting of 6.2 quite a lot. My presentation for this workshop will focus primarily on the initial report and the agreed electronic format. In part because it's quite timely to start having this discussion in light of the workshops and technical work that will be commencing next week on those specific topics. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just to provide a very broad overview in terms of the reporting constellation for Article 6. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the initial report, the updated initial report that can come in, and the annual information that comes in. I won't necessarily at this stage touch on the regular information or how that information is then put into the structured summary, which is where accounting and corresponding adjustment happens, or cover off the Article 6. The Article 6 technical expert review or the database. But in terms of the initial report, maybe 2 slides on, please. I'll just run you through very quickly, sort of like the first instance. 1 more slide, please. So just to give you where we're at, a very quick snapshot in terms of what was adopted in Sharm el-Sheikh. The outlines for both the initial updated reports have been published and agreed. They effectively follow the structure and heading lines of paragraph 18 in the Glasgow decision. These are also available in electronic format on the interim CARP, and the interim CARP is available to receive completed initial reports at this stage, so it's kind of in one sense open for business. In terms of the upcoming work, as I mentioned, we have a workshop on the potential challenges participating parties may face in addressing all of those different elements of the initial report, as well as any support to the identification of related capacity building needs. This will cover off the initial report and the AEF, and those workshops are scheduled for next week, 24th to 26th. I do believe it is in hybrid format. There's also an open invitation for parties to submit their view in relation to the use of the initial report, as well as requests to the Secretariat to prepare a technical paper based upon the workshop and any submissions received to that date, and on the longer term to develop a manual with no official status, which helps parties to complete and engage with these forms in a very similar way to that the Enhanced Transparency Framework has their handbook that helps parties to engage with the Enhanced Transparency Framework. Next slide, please. Again, this is just to highlight that the document is available on the webpage and can be submitted. So next slide. I'll just run you through sort of, there's probably 4 key sections of the initial report, and each one deals with different aspects of the parties' engagement and participation in Article 6. The first part deals with what is essentially the participation requirements. The first 2 are fairly easy or reasonable to address. The party that a party is a party to the Paris Agreement, and that it has submitted an NDC. Both of these, are available in different databases to be able to establish. Areas of keynote are probably around the information about how a party has the arrangements for authorizing the use of ITMOs, and there is an ongoing discussion in SABSA around authorization in terms of sort of formats and whether it can be revised. But in this aspect, the element that is here is the who within the party has responsibility for issuing that authorization and compiling and tracking data, And again, there's a lot of capacity building that's going on around what agency that needs and what institutional arrangements are needed and what legal arrangements are needed by parties to set those arrangements up. As well as, there's a number of discussions going on about whether or not this is the same entity that also addresses with 6.4, considering that 6.4, the statement of authorization is also there to be issued by a party, whether or not this is the same institutional arrangements. We also have how parties ensure the tracking, and this is essentially to what registry or registry system the party has or has access to. Including potentially the international registry, or if they are only using the mechanism registry as this tracking of ITMOs. Whether or not the party has submitted its most recent national inventory. Obviously, this is important when it comes to the regular reports and when it comes to the structured summary, as it's the information coming out of the inventories that will form the starting balance for the calculations to work out your adjusted emissions balance, as well as any of the information around how participating in Article 6 contributes to the NDC and the long-term development strategy if it's submitted one. Next slide, please. The second part deals with sort of a description of the NDC. This is essentially a lot of the information that would be submitted in your biannual transparency report in response to paragraph 64. Given that I think when we originally drafted the text, it was always assumed that initial reports and activities would be coming in well before those first BTRs. So this was always included as being a pre-submission of essentially information that will be needed from your transparency. And clearly this is information that would need to be consistent with what you later submit as part of your BTR, given that it addresses the same issues. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where we start to get into your engagement and how you wish to engage with Article 6 and how you're going to use it in your approach. The most sort of the key aspects in terms of is what is the metric, and in most cases this is whether it's a GHG metric ITMO, and that means you have a GHG metric NDC and indicators, or whether you have a non-GHG target or non-GHG indicators and thus are able to produce ITMOs in those non-GHG metrics as well. The next element that parties need to consider is their method of applying corresponding adjustment, and this is the method by which you establish the representativeness of your use and engagement with Article 6. We have two categories, which will depend upon what type of NDC you have, whether it is a single year, which is the majority of NDCs that have been communicated to date, or whether it's multi-year. And then you have different options for creating a comparator number, which your adjusted emissions balance will be compared to ensure representativeness. For a single year target, you have an indicative emissions trajectory. For GHG, for non-GHG, you have a trajectory for those indicators. For budget, again, it's mostly for GHG, as well as you have the option for averaging. Averaging itself, the mathematics of it are already included in the decision. But if you're choosing to use an emissions trajectory or budget, you also need to provide information on how you have calculated or determined that trajectory. So essentially, this is kind of for a budget. It's how have you calculated the budget for the entire NDC implementation period, and for an emissions trajectory, it's what is your starting balance, what is your final balance, and what is your year by year emissions level for that trajectory. We then have other further information in terms of quantification of the NDC. And again, this comes back into the final like a big picture number. And that's both for GHG and non-GHG types of NDCs, and as well as for policies and measures that aren't qualified, there is the option to provide information on the emissions that are associated with those policies and measures, as that then forms your starting balance and your comparator number. for the NDC implementation period. Next slide, please. Then we come into section 4, and this section 4 is something which is for each cooperative approach and is essentially replicated for each. So in this, I guess the key takeaway on that replication aspect is if you're a party that has 4 different cooperative approaches with different elements, while sections 1 to 3 may remain relatively static, this section 4 would be filled in for each of those cooperative approaches and submitted to the Secretariat. Now, if those 4 are already in existence in the first initial reports, you would replicate out this section 4 times within the document. And when you add a cooperative approach after you've submitted your initial report, that's where the updated initial report comes in, and again where you would really only focus on submitting the information for the new cooperative approach that you've entered into following the first submission of the initial report. Again, for each cooperative approach, we need to have a copy of the authorization. In particular, this is imperative for the host party, that we know that the host party has authorized and assumed the obligation to do corresponding adjustments for all ITMOs that are first transferred. The information around sort of meta level information around the cooperative approach, its duration, the expected volume of mitigation, the various participating parties, and any entities that are authorized within that cooperative approach. And again, I guess for authorized entities, that's also relevant for parties whose cooperative approach is participating in CORSIA, where there isn't really a counterparty to it, but where the host party has to authorize the end users, which is the airlines within CORSIA. You then have to provide information in terms of ensuring how your cooperative approach ensures environmental integrity, as well as information around various elements of the avoidance of negative economic and social risks, how you've addressed the 11th preambular paragraph, the links to sustainable development, in particular of the host party, as well as whether or not any resources for adaptation and whether or not overall mitigation of global emissions has been addressed. I think one aspect on this one is that for parties that are using the 6.4 mechanism, a lot of this information at this cooperative approach level is essentially provided by the mechanism itself, and you will be able to leverage that information in your initial reports. Next slide, please. The next element that I wanted to focus on in this initial introduction was the agreed electronic format. This was agreed in a draft format at Sharm el-Sheikh as a way of allowing countries and parties to get into practical experience in using the agreed electronic format, to essentially try it out and to come back at the end of the year with the aim of adopting a fully agreed one. Next slide, please. Again, what the information that the agreed electronic format tries to capture, it's levels on sort of transactional nature. So that's what paragraph 20A addresses. It deals kind of with the annual information on types of transactions that have occurred by the party. And again, it's kind of like it's on a calendar year. So you submit by the 15th of April, all of the information on the transactions that happened in the previous calendar year. Next slide, please. Then there's also information that's in the agreed electronic format that is metadata about the ITMO itself. It's not so much about just the transaction. It's about from what cooperative approach did the ITMO come from, whether it's authorized for whatever purpose. Is it NDC? Is it authorized for other international mitigation purposes? Who the first transferring party is, who the participating parties are, or any authorized entities, the year in which the mitigation occurred. And this is also important that while your transactions for a particular year might be transactions of a particular year or a calendar year, they may contain within them transactions that affect multiple calendar years for reporting purposes and adjustment purposes in the structured summary. So that's obviously one of the key criteria to be able to do and update your adjusted emissions balance, which is done on a calendar year, which is done on the year of mitigation basis for host parties or first transferring parties, as well as information on unique identifiers. And I think the next slide is kind of, if you go to the next slide, yeah, it just sort of like outlines again in terms of what those three main building blocks are. The first one is the actions that are performed on the ITMOs themselves, the part of the transactions that need to be reported. We have a holding balance that is essentially the balance that remains at the end of the year for the party once all those transactions have occurred, and then the information about the individual ITMOs in terms of all of the metadata relating to the ITMOs. Next slide, please. And the final thing I wanted to say around, in particular, the electronic format was also just a kind of, it seems like there's a lot of information that is being requested in terms of data and information about the ITMOs. And I think on this, I just wanted to highlight the reason why all that data is really being requested. And I think the most important element of the AEF is that this is what allows for the consistency checking and the recording of parties' transactions and recording of parties' the quantity of the aggregate number of first transfers and the aggregate number of uses and use for other international mitigation purposes that will then be transferred and translated into the database, which will give that party's kind of accounting snapshot on an ongoing basis. And the reason why the great granularity of information is required in the electronic format is to ensure that the consistency check that's done by the participating by the Secretariat is done and can facilitate that in an easy manner, so that we can trace first transfers to acquisitions to use in a very clear and traceable manner. And it will enable us to identify any of those inconsistencies where potentially someone has misrepresented the quantity for a particular transaction. We can clearly flag that and bring that to the attention of parties to correct. And with that, I will hand back to the chair. Oh, sorry, 1 second. Oh, sorry, 2 more slides on. I wanted to take the opportunity to remind you 1 more slide on as my final slide. Yeah, just again to remind parties, firstly, of the workshops which will address exactly these topics of the initial report and the agreed electronic format, and to again highlight that the guiding questions and the agenda for those discussions, those workshops from Monday to Wednesday are available on our cooperative implementation webpage, as well as to again invite parties that have got some experience to make submissions about their experiences as well. And with that, I will now hand back to the chair.